Hey everybody, Marcus here. It is an interesting experience to go back to works one had immensely enjoyed in their blue pill days and experience them for a second time as a red pill man. For me, one of these works is the Terry Goodkind fantasy series entitled The Sword of Truth. This video will be a review of the first book in that series entitled Wizard's First Rule. This review will necessarily need to contain spoilers in order for me to adequately describe what my red pill knowledge exposes to me. As such, I will begin with a general spoiler free description of the overarching plot, my conclusions and rating, followed by my analysis. In this way, anyone who wishes to read the book based on my recommendation can turn off the video, read the book, and return to this video later. Wizard's First Rule, along with the other 18 books in the series, are grim dark fantasy set in an original world thought up by the author. The books contain magic, various original fantastical creatures, as well as original takes on fantasy themes. Though a fantasy series, the book does not contain your Tolkien standard fare of orcs, elves, or dwarves. Most of the beings we encounter are fundamentally human, but distinguished by tradition as well as command of magic. The plot is one typified as the hero's journey. We are introduced to the main protagonist who starts out as a Joe Everyman at the beginning of the series and watch this character evolve into a hero. Star Wars did it with Luke. The Odyssey by Homer did it with Odysseus to a large degree, and countless other works followed this model as well. The literary device used is commonly referred to as the hero's journey. Now, there are 19 books in the series, but each contains a self-enclosed plot which has the typical Aristotelian setup of 3 acts. So, from a literary point of view, the book is completely unremarkable boilerplate writing. This book is not literature. The book is around 500 pages and would take you, say, around 4 days of committed reading to finish. The tone and feel of the book is a mixture of high fantasy and extremely graphic brutality. One chapter may read like your typical rated G family friendly Disney movie, while the next chapter will be a horrific snuff film that will surely disturb you. The author does not typically pull any punches or leave subject matter out that would be considered taboo. Children are commonly murdered, raped, and gutted in a level of descriptive detail that can really make you pause. However, the shock value is mostly contained to a banal purpose. The antagonists are depicted as evil, and as such, that message is communicated through the brutality I describe. In contrast, the protagonists are depicted as good, and their actions are somewhat expected. This is not really one of those gray area books, at least not, in my opinion, through the explicit intention of the author. The characters are meant to be mostly black and white. However, gray is introduced in an interesting way. It seems to me that both the antagonist and the protagonist share a common utilitarian moral system. The ends justify the means is a commonly recurring theme on both sides. This makes for an interesting read if you, however, subscribe to virtue ethics. Under virtue ethics, all the characters are pretty much screwed up and none at all can be said to be aspiring to be good. The plot is briefly as follows. The continent on which the plot takes place is divided into 3 regions. Each of the regions are separated from one another by a Trump-like wall. However, this is not a physical wall, but a magical wall. The wall is one of the underworld, the land of the dead. This means that if you try to walk through the wall, you will merely walk into the underworld to never be able to return. In essence, you kill yourself. The walls were put in place by a wizard for ideological reasons. The reasons relate to the role of magic in the life of man. Some believe magic ought to be stamped out, while others believe it was culturally enriching and so on. Anyways, one of the walls has been brought down and an army from the easternmost territory has begun a campaign to conquer the Middle Land, conveniently named the Midlands. This in turn causes an emissary named Kaelin, a woman from the Midlands with a certain magical power, to travel to the westmost territory, called Westland, to search for the wizard who had originally put up the walls. The main protagonist is a Westlander called Richard Cypher, a woods guide who has never experienced magic due to Westland's ideological purity of considering magic as bad. So, the hero's journey is centered around Richard and Kaelin. A romance inevitably ensues as they work towards defeating the invading armies of the eastmost territory called Dahara. Now, I don't know why the author would give names to the territories like Westland, Midland, and Dahara, as opposed to Westland, Midland, and Eastland, other than to give a certain Middle Eastern feel to the bad guys. In fact, the symbolism between Dahara and the Arab world is pretty striking. The book was written in 1994, but it has some amusing, coincidental contemporary politics mixed in. So, like I mentioned, the book is fairly boilerplate in many ways. However, I find the execution to be absolutely brilliant. As my review carries on, we will come to discover some of the brilliance in the setup of this world and its creatures as it pertains to the male female dynamic. I very much would recommend this book. The first 6 books are fantastic, with the sixth being the best. Everything after that begins to turn into more of a cash grab than anything else, as the author clearly begins to run out of ideas. The sixth book is particularly interesting, as it is mostly a commentary on socialism. The main villain from book 3 onwards is for the most part trying to bring about the socialist utopia, well, we have also heard so much about. Wizard's First Rule's brilliance rests in the setup between Richard and Kaelin. Now, Socrates said that in virtually all cases, poets of great works are just as ignorant of the meaning of their works as the common man. He argues that they are inspired by a muse who speaks through them, making the poet a tool of the gods as opposed to the author of the work. I believe something like this may be happening in Wizard's First Rule. It is either the case that Goodkind happened to coincidentally author a story meant to capitalize on red pill truth, or he is the most red pilled author ever. This book, if orchestrated intentionally, would demand the author to understand male female relations to the level of the most insightful MGTOW. Now, this is not a red pill book, or for that matter, speaks a red pill message. Not at all. This is a book authored by a seemingly hardcore red pillar to capitalize on a blue pill audience by giving the blue pillars exactly what he wants. As such, either the author is hardcore red pill, or he was inspired by a muse and is himself grossly ignorant of why what he did works. This book is designed to appeal to both men and women. In one sense, it could be seen as a romance novel masquerading as a fantasy adventure. In another sense, it can be argued it is little more than a fantasy adventure with a romance subplot. My conclusion is that it is both. It is a romance novel to women and a fantasy adventure to men. The themes, characters, and world setup are so brilliantly woven together around the male-female dynamic that it really would take a MGTOW to see the ploy. Okay, this is the part where the spoilers begin. I will contain the spoilers to the first book, even though I have read all 19 and know what happens later. So, if what I have said so far appeals to you and grim dark fantasy is of interest, then I recommend you read the book. Now, on to the analysis. First, we need to understand the characters. Richard Scyther is the main protagonist. The book opens with a scene in the woods where Richard is described according to his in-depth knowledge of the woods, plants, and pathfinding. He is immediately painted as someone of worth, which will appeal, of course, to the female reader. However, this is slightly tempered for the male mind by justifying his knowledge based on a life of having lived in the woods and being tutored by a wise old man named Zed. This is the first theme we will need to keep in mind. The theme is the mixture of some inherent worth of the character being flaunted while giving lip service in little space as to its reasonable justification. What I mean by this theme is as follows. Much more space on the page is devoted to describing Richard's worth and status than is given to describing the process in which he acquired it. The female mind likes to hear about the status irrespective of how it came about, while the male mind looks for justification. By allotting more page space to the description of worth as opposed to the process of acquiring it, the female mind is satiated better, while the male mind still gets its fix of justification in a couple brief sentences later on. Immediately following this description of Richard, Richard sees a woman in the far distance traveling in the woods. The woman is wearing a white dress and is followed by 4 men. This triggers Richard's white knight instinct. Following a short inner monologue evaluating whether or not those men are out to hurt the woman, Richard decides to run to intercept her and then guide her down some side forest path in anticipation of throwing off the potential trackers. Richard is unarmed. A point is made to describe him having forgotten his knife at home. The inner monologue that took place reveals the second theme: morally rationalized white knighting. Richard does not conduct a prudent evaluation of the situation. He merely rationalizes his white knighting instincts by assigning moral obligation upon himself to follow it. This theme is later expanded into a twofold inner morality for Richard. Richard will eventually come to have one method of justifying his actions as it pertains to everything except Kaelin, and a second set of justifications as it pertains to his actions in relation to Kaelin. Richard intercepts Kaelin and leads her down a trail which leads towards a town. It appears the two have gotten away, but are dramatically intercepted and surrounded by the four men. These men are all described as bigger than Richard and armed to the teeth. The four men provide Richard the option to just walk away, as their business was with Kaelin and not him. Now, Richard is unarmed and he is outnumbered. He tried his plan to lead Kaelin down a different path to outrun the men, and he failed. His inner monologue indicates his awareness of certain death. His moral duty, which he, even in his own mind, ought to have been fulfilled at this point, however, forces him into what he perceives as certain death. So, he stays to fight, a choice so irrational it defies belief. It is important to know that Richard was not demonstrating courage in choosing to fight. Richard was demonstrating reckless abandon, which is itself a vice and moral failing in Aristotelian virtue ethics. This seeming self-sacrifice on his part is what would appeal to the female mind, while the blue pill male reader, safely sitting in his easy chair, would cheer Richard on and imagine himself also capable of making such a sacrifice to appeal to his own white knight instinct. Clearly, Richard and Kaelin win the fight with a mixture of her magic and luck. The flirting and subtle indicators of interest start to show up immediately after the fight, but are not really expressed in much words. You see, what I have described so far are the first 2 chapters or so of the book. This could easily be either the beginning of a romance novel or an adventure story. Richard, in a brief 20 pages, is already painted as possessing skills, the white knight instinct, the will to sacrifice himself for a woman who is a complete stranger, and some level of fighting prowess even when completely outclassed. Kaelin, on the other hand, has already been described to possess very feminine traits. Firstly, she has very long hair, whose relevance becomes important later. She is wearing a very elegant white dress while walking through the woods, which is explicitly described as having not become dirty from either the trek through the woods or even the fight. Kaelin has green eyes, another rare and exotic trait in general. She is described as quite young, early 20s, and beautiful. Finally, she is clearly painted as someone of worth if 4 men were sent to kill her, and again, her worth is insinuated by Richard's choice to enter a fight on her behalf, even though he sees fighting as certain death. This is doubly compounded when you consider that Richard knows nothing of Kaelin at this stage, other than she is a woman, and therefore it seems to him worth helping. Now, how did the two win the fight? Well, Kaelin is what is referred to in the story as a confessor. A confessor is a woman with a specific function and magical power. Only women can be confessors. When a confessor touches a person and releases her power, the person she touches immediately falls madly in love with the confessor. This power is on a 1 to 2 hour cooldown. The person touched with this power, due to their intense love, will completely subjugate their will to the confessor even into death. The person touched will never do anything to disappoint the confessor that touched them. Kaelin, however, later in the story is described as possessing the title of Mother Confessor. That title is similar to being like the Confessor Pope. The role of the confessor is usually to touch people who have been condemned to death by trial to see if the person actually committed the crime. So basically, if the verdict turned out to be unjust, the person would be spared but would exist in this state of obsessive love for the confessor. So, the four men that were sent to kill Kalen are referred to in the story as a quad. They are trained to kill confessors. It is anticipated that the confessor will touch one man in the quad, which leaves the other three men to kill both the touched man and the confessor. Kalen touched one of the men in the fight, Richard kicked one off a cliff, and the touched man killed one and then threw himself at the second, where both men fell off the cliff. Now, this is where this whole confessor thing really thickens the plot. We learn later in the book that when a confessor has sex, she cannot control her power, and therefore the man she has sex with falls madly in love with her. So, confessors cannot just go riding the cock carousel based on the laws of the land. They only ever choose one mate because it is also the law that the confessor line must continue. She gets to pick whoever she wants as a mate, and people fear being chosen. Kaylin has not yet chosen a mate. This means she is a virgin. Finally, the status of a woman is externally displayed by the length of her hair, and confessors are the highest authority in the Midlands and therefore above even kings and queens. This status is visually displayed by the length of her hair. The longer the hair a woman has, the higher her station. Kaylin has the longest hair in the Midlands. Well, guys like long hair on a woman. Now, do you now see what I mean about the interweaving of the structure of the world with the female male dynamic? Let us look at Kaylin again. She was born a confessor, therefore, she has immense worth by virtue of what she is and not what she has accomplished. This appeals to the woman reader. She has long hair and is a virgin. This appeals to the male reader. However, she is obligated by custom and law to be both that, which grants an excuse for having these traits. This means that a woman reader need not feel bad about herself for not possessing those traits that Kaylin has, because they were imposed on her while simultaneously rewarding the male desire for those traits by putting them into Kaylin. A similar story is true of Kaylin only being able to have one mate. This panders to the insecurities of the beta male in assurance that Kaylin won't cheat, while the one mate rule can be understood as a necessary restriction out of Kaylin's control by the female reader. Finally, Kaylin's power allows her to force anyone to fall madly in love with her, and that person will do anything whatsoever for her. Now, confessors, when they touch a man, basically turn him into the archetypical pussy begging white knight. He will literally do anything and everything for her while making sure he never does anything to displease her. This means that a touched man will always be asking for permission, be greatly insecure that his actions are displeasing to his mistress, and so on. Confessors do not like the men they touch. They do not like these men because it is rationalized as depriving these men of loving the confessor of their own volition. However, we can clearly see this is plausible deniability for the stark truth that women hate pussy beggars and prefer the bad boys. A touched man would no longer have the ability to say no to the confessor, and so could never be sexually exciting to a woman. All of this also reinforces the theme of the woman playing hard to get. Though Kaylin and Richard fall in love with each other the old fashioned way, Kaylin's powers set up a sort of artificial chase that Richard must go through to get Kaylin. Now, this is brilliant writing, as it allows the author to have Kaylin put Richard through a never ending stream of shit tests, all masquerading as Kaylin's desire not to hurt Richard with her power. The shit tests are unrelenting and are masterfully woven into forwarding the plot. One shit test in particular stands out. At one point, Richard and Kaylin need to figure out where to find a certain magical box. They conclude their best bet is to approach the savage tribe referred to as the Mud People and request that this tribe call for a gathering in which they can ask the spirits of the underworld to tell them where the box is. Goodkind orchestrates the plot in such a manner as the Mud People demand that both Kaylin and Richard must first become Mud People before the request is granted. After jumping through various hoops, the Mud People decide to give Richard and Kaylin Mud People citizenship. However, part of the ceremony of becoming a Mud person demands that Richard choose a wife. Kaylin, in turn, conceals this requirement from Richard, and Richard is ambushed in the ceremony by a bunch of women, all vying to be selected by him as his wife. Well, naturally, Kaylin hides behind the justification that this is for the greater good, and that Richard's feelings for her are not as important as the quest at hand. Now, this would be all well and good if Kaelin was not a pouting little bitch about the whole thing. Clearly, the reader is meant to see Kaelin's resentment for Richard, not the Mud People, in relation to potentially having sex with another woman. Richard orchestrates a clever trick in which he asserts that his semen may turn out to be poison to a woman from the Midlands for reasons which are not important, and as a consequence, the Mud People remove this requirement from the ceremony. Richard passes his shit test. Kaelin is all happy, and the plot carries on. There are many other similar shit tests woven into the plot. The female reader will clearly be able to relate to these tests while feeling justified that Kaelin is simply had no choice in issuing them due to her being a confessor. In essence, Kaelin's love for Richard necessitated the shit tests for his own protection. Now, let me talk about Richard. Richard starts off as a woods guide in the story. This is a humble position clearly beneath the station of a mate a mother confessor would ever choose. However, Richard's station and status rise exponentially as the story progresses. Now, the rise of Richard's status is paralleled by Kaelin's love for him. When he was a woods guide, he was just a nice guy who Kaelin did not have any real interest in. This can be plausibly explained also by the fact that Kaelin had only met Richard and did not have time to fall in love with him. Richard is soon named Seeker of Truth by Zed, the old man who served as Richard's mentor throughout his life. Zed turns out to be that great wizard who Kaelin traveled to Westland to find. Now, here's the interesting thing about the title of Seeker of Truth. Earlier, I mentioned that Kaelin, as the Mother Confessor, held the highest title in the Midlands. Well, there's only one station higher than Mother Confessor, and guess which one that is? The Seeker of Truth. Hypergamy is satisfied in our little Richard and Kaelin romance. When Richard is named Seeker, the romance really starts to speed up. Yet, this is not the end of Richard's ascent. In the middle of the book, we come to learn that the great wizard Kaelin was sent to find, Zed, is really Richard's grandfather. This in turn gives Richard even more importance. At the end of the book, we find out that Richard's father is actually the main antagonist of the story, Darken Rall, Lord of Dahara. This in turn makes Richard royalty. In fact, after Richard kills Darken Rall, Richard becomes the new Lord Rall of Dahara. With every elevation of Richard's status in the story, so too does Kaelin's love for Richard rise. The plausible deniability rests in the flow of time. Of course, Kaelin will only fall more in love with Richard as time goes on. Well, at least that is what we are led to accept as the rationalization, as opposed to the coincidental ascent of Richard's status. This set of revelations about Richard allow the female reader to live out her hypergamous instinct within a single man, namely, Richard. Kaelin nor the female reader do not ever need to trade Richard up for a better deal, because Richard becomes himself a better deal as the plot unfolds. Now, when Richard was named the Seeker of Truth, he was given the Sword of Truth as the weapon he is to wield. The Sword of Truth is also a fascinating plot device. You see, the Sword of Truth, when touched, fills the holder of it with rage. The rage is meant to help the Seeker be a more effective warrior. However, Richard is described as having had an upbringing in which he has always controlled his anger. In fact, part of Richard's growth in becoming a more effective wielder of the Sword of Truth is his journey on getting more in touch with his feelings. As in, Richard is rewarded by the Sword of Truth when he gives into his feelings as opposed to reason or stoic resolve. We are all aware of women's insistence that men need to stop repressing their emotions and get in touch with their feelings. Well, the author put that female desire of men into the mechanic of the Sword of Truth. The characters in the book continually reinforce the idea that everyone needs to follow the instincts of the Seeker. This instinct is little more than a mask for feelings. Every time Richard goes with his feelings, he seems to make the correct decision. In turn, he is rewarded with better fighting prowess and he achieves his goals. Richard, in turn, becomes more like a woman as the story goes on. However, in reality, the outcomes would be virtually opposite. For example, fighters who lose themselves in anger often make mistakes. Richard, in turn, is set to become a better fighter when he gives into his passions. On the other side of the coin, when reason is applied in the story, reason clean of emotion that is, nothing good happens. This adoption of feminine traits by Richard clearly appeals to the female reader, but since it is balanced out by an increase in prowess in masculine traits, the male reader is satiated as well. Since the author rewards Richard each time he goes with his feelings, the male reader can be bamboozled into buying into this approach. Now, this review is already pretty long, so let me bring it to a close. Earlier, I mentioned that Kaylin, as a confessor, would lose control over her power if she ever had sex with Richard, and therefore destroy him. This tension of the romance, however, was resolved in an interesting manner. At the end of the book, Kaylin was forced to confess Richard. Richard, in turn, behaved as if he was confessed, even though he was not. Since a confessed person cannot lie to the confessor who confessed him, everything Richard said was considered the truth. In this way, Richard was able to trick Dark and Rahl into doing something which ultimately killed him. Now, the justification that the author gives to the reader on why Kaylin's power did not work on Richard was, as one would expect it. Apparently, Richard was so in love with Kaylin that the magic could not create any more love in him for her blah 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 blah. Basically, Richard's love for Kaylin protected Richard from, love. Well, it's fantasy. It does not need to make sense. We are meant to go with our feelings. And by the time we are done reading 500 pages of this romance, our feelings want us to believe the justification given by the author because we are meant to feel Kaylin and Richard deserve to be together. Now, this in turn brings us to the wizard's first rule itself. In this fantasy setting, wizards have certain rules that they follow. The first rule states, Wizard's first rule: people are stupid. People are stupid. Given proper motivation, almost anyone will believe almost anything. Because people are stupid, they will believe a lie because they want to believe it's true or because they are afraid it might be true. People's heads are full of knowledge, facts, and beliefs, and most of it is false, yet they think it all true. People are stupid. They can only rarely tell the difference between a lie and the truth, and yet they are confident they can, and so are all the easier to fool. Thanks for listening. Go team.